Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this town hall, better than Bill 64. We're going to start the town hall by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, including those that resulted in hundreds of children being buried in unmarked graves at residential schools across Canada. We dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We're going to have a series of panelists and a through a discussion of options, which are much better than Bill 64. I'm going to just do a short introductory PowerPoint, and then we're going to move on to our speakers. I need to share the screen and okay. Now, the problem with Bill 64, in fact, there are many problems, and we're not going to tonight delve into those, but we're going to address a critical issue that is not covered in Bill 64, and that is how to improve the quality of education. The real issues when we're looking at quality are students who are struggling because they're poor, have learning or behavioral difficulties, or disadvantaged. Ensuring that Indigenous students are helped and that Indigenous knowledge and culture are shared and taught as part of reconciliation. New immigrants who come to Manitoba need better attention. We need to remember that diversity is who we are in Manitoba and that we need to build a world without racism and discrimination. And a failure to address these issues will result in increased social problems and crime. One of the big issues is that 10 to 20% of students in Manitoba are doing less well than most students. These are often students with learning or behavioral issues, students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need an approach which helps all children, but which at the same time enables these children and youth to thrive. Now, poverty comes up very often as a reason for children doing poorly. But as I learned from the superintendent in the Seine River School Division, and as he tells his principals and teachers, never use poverty as an excuse for children not learning. What they do in Seine River School Division is to identify areas and schools in the division where poverty is a major issue. They make sure they're providing school breakfasts and lunches, as do many other divisions. They provide a program called Kids at Play, which is half-day school and half-day childcare and childhood education for all kindergarten children. And it has done marvels in getting children ready for school. They have implemented the Roots of Empathy program over a number of years so that kids are more understanding of other kids, and this has helped a lot. They have provided extra resources where children are struggling, things like reading recovery, resource teachers, social workers, alternative high school programs. But we're going to move beyond the poverty issues. Children in areas where families are less well off are now doing as well as those in other areas. In Seine River, the whole school division has moved from below the provincial average to above. We can address poverty, but we need to look at options, and we're going to look at options today to how we improve Manitoba's education system. And we're going to look at options which were not addressed in Bill 64. The first panelists, we've got a tag team here, Doug Adams and Heather Shelton. Doug is a retired teacher who taught for many years as a diverse school in Brandon, the New Era School. And Heather Shelton has had decades of experience in the classroom. And together they've developed a remarkably successful approach, which they're going to talk about, competency-based education. Over to you, Doug and Heather.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by kind of painting a picture of what our beginnings were. Several years ago, we were experiencing much frustration and, yes, sadness, because we recognized that the students in our care were being hampered in their progress. Our students were not engaged because A, they couldn't do the required grade level work because they didn't have the necessary foundation skills to achieve the next level of learning, or they had the necessary skills to move forward in their learning, but were stuck in a grade level because of their age. There was also a very high level of diversity in each of our classrooms. Combined graded classrooms can lead to as many as 6 levels of ability in each classroom. We were also dealing with high transiency rates. Often a child would have been in 6, 7 classrooms before they reached grade 4. There was also a high level of poverty and a high enrollment of immigrant children. On the other hand, we had children who were working at or slightly above the grade level. Much time and resources were spent on the development of IEPs, behavior plans, and resource programs, as well as classroom programs.
First slide. Students are often in a grade level which may be age appropriate, but may not be ability appropriate. We all learn at different speeds. Our students are no different. When we learn a new skill, for example, golfing or painting, not many of us begin by being experts or even proficient. We would be very uncomfortable if we were asked to enter a PGA tournament or asked to enter a juried art show. We build skill upon skill. Being in a grade level that is age appropriate does not ensure that specific needs are being met.
We have another slide, please. And another one. According to Carol Ann Tomlinson and M. Lane Cowley's Teach Me, Teach My Brain, a call for differentiated classrooms, 3 principles from brain research: emotional safety, appropriate challenge, and self-constructed meaning suggest that a one-size-fits-all approach to classroom teaching is ineffective for most and harmful to some. Doug and I have discovered in our years in the classroom, and that would be a combined 57 years in a core area school, that students need to feel connected. Could we have the next slide, please? They need to feel connected in that they need to feel that they're belonging to a community of learners. They have a fit, they have a place. They need to feel capable. That is, they need to feel that they can handle the tasks at hand. And they need to feel that they are contributing. They need to feel that they contribute to the learning process and progress of the community in which they are working.
In a traditional graded classroom based on age, there may be up to 5 ability skill levels for any given outcome. Each of these levels requires instructional time of the teacher to provide direct instruction so that learning can occur. Having to do this within 5 different groups at the same time with one teacher in one classroom is akin to asking a surgeon to perform 5 different surgeries in one operating room. To increase competency in essential math and language arts skills, we developed the following process. Firstly, we select an outcome to be taught that is aligned with the grade levels in the pod. Next slide. Ideally, the pod should consist of a breakdown of early years and middle years ages. Secondly, we provided an assessment that covers the outcome to be taught and the various levels at each grade to determine the student's current level of performance. So the students would work through the assessment to the spot that they could go, and then we were able to determine what level they were at. From there, we would make groupings based on the various skill levels determined and assign each teacher to each group to be instructed within the pod. Movement within the groups may occur as students' progress is made and outcomes achieved. Following the instruction, there is a post-assessment of the outcome and plotting of student progress on a continuum of outcomes. The continuum of outcomes becomes part of the reporting process to students and parents. Next slide. We've prepared a chart here to take a look at the traditional grouping and also the instruction for competency grouping, which we're looking at. And in the traditional grouping, that's age grouping only, and progress is in a lockstep manner. One concept is taught. Whereas in the instruction for competency, it's multi-age ability grouping, and progress is according to growth in the ability.
In a traditional grouping, we find that one teacher attempts to teach all levels of ability. With this, they can become frustrated. They don't feel like they're connected. They don't feel like they belong. They don't feel that they're capable or that they can contribute to the learning that's taking place. With competency grouping, we have spread those. If we had 4 classrooms, we'd spread 4 teachers, give each teacher a group or an ability to deal with. That teacher can address the needs, develop suitable resources, etc. And during the time of learning, the students are all of a sudden feeling the success of their learning. They feel capable, they feel connected, and they feel like they're contributing.
In traditional grouping, students see others working on material that is different because the teacher is attempting to differentiate instruction. And this work is often either easier or more difficult, and self-esteem is diminished. This can lead to students to act out or disengage from what is going on in the class. Whereas in the instruction for competency grouping, students are working on a similar activity where learners are engaged in the same work, their self-esteem is bolstered, they take pride in their progress, and there is a feeling that they can do the work because they're working at the level that they need instruction at that point so that they can move forward.
We often see in traditional grouping the huge gaps that are occurring. Those gaps can be for a lot of different reasons: poverty, transiency, absenteeism, or a lack of competency in the language of instruction. Those gaps don't lessen, they grow. And by the time a child gets to school or to high school and has those huge gaps, their self-esteem is low and they're about to drop out of school, and many of them do. Whereas if you plan for competency and group for competency, the gaps are lessened. It leaves the foundation skills to be built one skill at a time from the ground up.
In the traditional grouping, assessment is less precise as it is in standardized testing because students may be assessed on outcomes for which they are not ready to learn because of gaps in their foundation skills. Whereas in the instructional for competency grouping, assessment is more precise because the gaps have been removed, allowing foundation skills to be built in a way that assessment becomes viable and reliable. And this continuum of outcomes becomes part of the reporting process for students.
Often we see too in traditional classrooms that the limit is placed on the learning. You learn this far and that's all you learn. You don't go further unless you've got a teacher that can handle yet again another level. But in competency grouping, there are no limits to the learning. Each student has the foundation skill that they can move ahead at their pace. The groups are fluid, so that once they are suited to their level of learning, they're free to go on. So they consequently experience pride, they take pride in their learning, and they're excited. We've seen it, they are excited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug and Heather. That was a really good, clear demonstration of how competency-based learning can work and the difference and the positive effects. And that really comes from your own experience, that you found a dramatic decrease in behavioral and disciplinary problems in the classrooms which you had competency-based learning.
Yes.
We're going to move next to Victoria Romero. Victoria is just completed her first year university at the University of Manitoba. She is connected closely to classroom learning, understands it, but tonight she wants to tell us all about project-based learning, which she's been looking at very carefully recently. Over to you, Victoria.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, so my name is Victoria, and today I'm going to be presenting about project-based learning, which is a really cool alternative to the traditional academic environment. So, project-based learning is a little bit different than what you might regularly see in the classroom. So instead of students solely learning through the curriculum, they learn through doing different projects. So there are still some areas that need to be handled in part through more traditional learning methods, such as math, like more particularly calculus in the older grades. But other than that, projects can be used for a variety of different subject material. And through project-based learning, students are really challenged to collaborate with everyone in the learning environment and communicate and develop and use their critical thinking skills. They can also explore their learning potential beyond the regular classroom thinking and those four classroom walls. Project-based learning is a really effective alternative that emphasizes engagement and developing multiple different skills that students will need in real life. The project-based learning model kind of follows as so. So the educator will pose a question, or the students will develop a project based on their interest. Then students will come up with what path they need to take in order to solve the question or to figure out the project. They test and check their own methods, and through doing this, they develop critical thinking skills while they are learning their information. So by solving the question or working through the project, students are able to apply what they have learned in that kind of real world application, because usually projects are more so involved with the community or what's going on. This method of learning integrates collaborative, student-centered, and active learning, again, in a way that prepares students for the modern employment environment. So with those critical thinking skills, students are more ready to be challenged in the work environment, whether it be having tasks, being tasked with certain things, or whatever else. Students are more prepared to be able to think outside the box and thinking on the go, especially. One really appealing part of the project-based learning method is that it really is student-centered and it engages students. And it is generally more appealing than traditional coursework such as tests or quizzes. I don't know about anyone here, but I've never really been a fan of tests or quizzes. I'd much rather do a project. And another thing about that is that this learning approach is, again, more likely to be applicable in real life, especially since you're not just doing comprehension, you're building actual skills that you need. And then again, the projects can also be closely tied into real world events, so students can learn about what's currently going on in their community and the world around them through their projects. Through project-based learning, educators can cover multiple different aspects of the curriculum, including math and English in one singular project. So this this freedom allows students to explore the subjects more in depth, and it also gives time for teachers and educators to teach the subjects more in depth, as they're not worried about having to do different assessments for different subjects. And when teachers have more time, the learning experience is obviously going to be better for the students as well. A variety of different skills and academic criteria can be assessed through one singular project. So it's a really good way to maximize the time that students have in school. The project-based learning model can also really be modified and adapted to suit the needs of every individual learner. So educators can adjust projects based on each individual student's academic ability. So this is a really good option for those who either don't learn well or aren't doing as well as they could be in the traditional school environment. And particularly in Manitoba, where we have 10 to 20% of students who are not succeeding the way they could be, this is something that is really important to be looked at. When students have their learning needs met, they are more likely to want to go to school, they're more likely to want to apply themselves, and you're probably going to see a better outcome is when students are passionate about something, they're learning about what they want to do, they're more likely to have a better outcome from it. In Manitoba, there's a few places where you can see project-based learning in action, one of which is at the Maples Met School. So project-based learning opportunities are very central to their curriculum. They supplement their internship programs. So students are assigned various long and short-term projects throughout the year. And aside from just working and completing the projects, there are also 3 exhibition days during the year where they can present their projects to not only their teachers and peers, but friends and family can also be invited. So that's another encouragement for some students, because it's really nice to show off what you're passionate about and what you've learned. So that's another encouraging factor of this model. One thing that's really great about project-based learning is that, again, it's very easy to adapt, especially to different circumstances, such as online or remote learning that we're seeing right now. So students can easily do group work, research their projects, and create them in online format through different software. And project-based learning is probably a bit more easier to facilitate through online or remote learning, as opposed to traditional assignments such as tests or quizzes. Again, that collaborative element and the research can still be present all through online, different software such as Zoom, Office. So overall, the project-based learning method is a really awesome alternative to the regular academic structure, not only for the students, but for everybody involved in the learning process. And it's especially interesting and intriguing for those who are struggling in the traditional system. So I think that this would be a great option to be explored in Manitoba, and maybe one day we'll be able to see it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. It's good to see you excited at looking at different ways of learning. We'll now move to Sheva Schwartz. Sheva is a first-year student at the University of Winnipeg studying political science. She's been involved in the Liberal Party as a delegate to a national convention. She's currently working for me as a summer student. She's going to talk about putting a priority on teaching leadership skills rather than necessarily putting curriculum first. So over to you, Sheva.
Thank you so much. So the model that I'll be explaining today is a leadership model, and this is a 21st century approach to teaching, because as we see that the world has less of those repeatable jobs that were really served well by skills like obedience or conformity, those were really valued, say 100 years ago, but increasingly it's skills like communication or cooperation which may be in the context of a global workforce, as well as creative endeavors. Those are all skills that are really important in today's professional world and also today's society. And leadership is really the embodiment of those traits. Leadership is competence and reciprocity and cooperation. All of those things are central to what great leaders possess, which is why the focus on leadership is really appropriate for today's day and age. So this leadership model is really about a cultural shift that can happen in the school. So one way that this is done is students, staff, and teachers are all given the title of leader. So a student may be leader of science or leader of the playground, and staff, say a janitor, might be leader of school cleanliness. And so these are ways to attach, just attaching the word leader onto a student or staff member can give them a title and a standard to live up to. And it also brings in their talents that might not otherwise be recognized in school. So this is a holistic view of students. Say they're incredible at art and that normally doesn't really enter the classroom, but this way it can be. This is also facilitated by the use of data notebooks, and these are notebooks that contain basically a compendium of the students' achievements and how that's being monitored through class schoolwork, and that's updated weekly. It's monitored by the teachers, and it's also brought to the parents so that they can be involved in this process. And this is self-directed by the students. So if something's very important to them that they want to work at, but they might not otherwise in the classroom, they can bring that in, and that can be part of their role as a student. And what has been seen with these data notebooks is that students are very proud of them, they're very excited, and it really is just a good way that students can actually see their progress and also have it not be shown as progress based on what other people are doing. It's not looking at what others around you are doing. It's just comparing yourself to a past version of yourself. So this was done at the A.B. Combs Elementary School in North Carolina. They were the first school to use this kind of model. And within just a few years, they saw that there was a jump from 84 to 97% of students passing end of grade tests based on the curriculum that was already in place. And this was in a diverse student body where 40% of the students received free or reduced lunches, and they represented 58 different countries. So we can see that this model actually does apply well to the curriculum that's already there. It doesn't really add a lot in terms of material. It's seen as a better way of doing what teachers were already doing. And it just is a lens to view everything through. So even anything from reading comprehension to math, they can all be viewed in the way of leaders and being what being a leader means. So this was also done using the book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is how A.B. Combs did it. They gave teachers training in this book, and they talked a lot about these 7 habits, which are sequenced in terms of independence, interdependence, and renewal. So for example, beginning with the end in mind, that's independence, that's learning how to set goals, and seeking first to understand, then to be understood. That's interdependence, that's cooperating well with others. So as a final thought, this leadership model gives students a standard to meet, and of course, once their basic needs are met, as Dr. Gerard mentioned, making sure that they're fed and those basic needs are met, and then they can rise to these standards. They can see themselves as competent, even if it's just in one area. It's also teaching them that it's good to be good at anything, no matter what it is. That just gives them a basis for pursuing other things because they have that confidence and self-esteem. And that really is seeing yourself as good at something, whatever it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheva. Wonderful. It really emphasizes that, when kids are learning, that it's much more than just learning math and reading, that it really is kids learning how to be people and learning self-confidence and self-esteem. So thank you. We're going to move on to Negin Sinclair. Negin is Anishinaabe, an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba, He's a regular commentator on Indigenous issues and has written extensively on Indigenous perspectives. He's a co-editor of award-winning Indigenous writings and works. He originally did a BA in education at the University of Winnipeg and an MA in Native and African American literature at the University of Oklahoma. Negin, I spent 2 6-month period down in University of Oklahoma, so nice to see somebody else who was there.
That's a nice school down there. At the time, it was the only Indigenous literature program in North America, and still is one of only 2. So it's a pretty impressive program. I just want to, I don't have much time tonight, so I just want to say a few things. I want to say huge miigwech to all of my fellow presenters who are expressing concern on Bill 64 and the whole issue around the things that it will threaten and the things that perhaps are the most concerning. I want to talk a little bit about the 3 most essential things that are necessary for Indigenous education to thrive. We're only at the beginning stages in this province of beginning to incorporate Indigenous pedagogy in classrooms, never mind the hallways and the office and the library, which we've not started at all. And the fact is that we have only started a very minute and small amount of curricular content and inclusion, and that's not where reconciliation is at. In fact, that's not reconciliation whatsoever. All that is competency. And so we have a struggle in which to raise Manitobans, to raise a future Manitoba that is competent, that can face the reality. And the reality is this: every single person will be working with, living beside, sitting on a bus beside, or be married to an Indigenous person. In fact, most of us already are. And the fact is this, is that if you cannot work with an Indigenous person effectively, if you hold racist stereotypes or beliefs, or you have particularly ideas and beliefs that divide us, you are incompetent, you are incapable to work in this place, and most importantly, you're a problem for the rest of us. The rest of us have to deal with this incredible divisive language that certain politicians use. You can imagine who I'm talking about. You can also imagine the issues that our children have to face when they look to us to try to get together and try to live in this place effectively. And most importantly, the ongoing break in this socioeconomic situation within the province. I'm sorry that my cat is continually wanting to present with me here. That the socioeconomic challenges that we have in the province, the gap is widening more than ever. And the reality is this, is that the Indigenous workforce, the Indigenous economy, and most importantly, Manitobans who have to work with Indigenous peoples, whether it be in workplaces or jails, the fact is that we all have to face the reality of living together. So here's what we need. We need to build schools that have competency in locality, not centering forces in the, somewhere on Broadway Avenue in Winnipeg. That is the #1 thing we need to not do, because when you take the control of education out of locality and you put it in a far off community, what does that sound like? What formula has that led to a disaster when it involves Indigenous peoples? When you have decisions in Ottawa that are being made for people in remote areas, what does that look like? Well, that's tainted water, that's brutal, terrible Indian agents, that's absolutely inappropriate visions of what is the expectation, the ideas of success, the ideas of what education should be for Indigenous students. The fact is that no one in Winnipeg knows what people in Puckatawagan need. And the fact is the people in Puckatawagan know what people need. And so, when we take the control out of places like Frontier School Division or Lakeshore School Division, places that are doing remarkable things in locality and supporting local educators to take leadership roles, particularly Indigenous educators, because it is Indigenous peoples who will lead Indigenous education. No one on Broadway Avenue will lead Indigenous education. It will be only Indigenous people, period. #2. That leadership, we know that we live in a place in which we are recovering from an incredible amount of racism, and that racism is still ongoing. I don't have to prove that to you. You simply just have to look at the way our government looks, the way that our culture looks, the way that the leadership in almost every institution in this country looks. Racism is alive and well, and I don't have to remind you of the current events that have happened to remind us that that is very much a life and death situation for Indigenous peoples. Leadership is only beginning in those areas that have historically disenfranchised Indigenous peoples in the localities, the small school divisions throughout the province. So now what we're going to do is we're going to erase all of that progress, And we're going to take it to a place that is probably the most racist of all, which is the centering force of government here in this province. Frankly, I don't really care what party is leading. It's inevitably about Indigenous peoples being disenfranchised from those halls of power. And I don't have absolutely any faith whatsoever that any provincial government will be able to incorporate Indigenous leadership at the educational level in what's needed for people in local communities. And frankly, we need to build local leadership within Indigenous communities, within areas that are working with Indigenous peoples. And frankly, we need to build competent Canadian leaders that can work effectively with Indigenous peoples in those localities, in those local spaces. It will not happen on Broadway. Third, the idea that we take this grand notion of a mega school district, which will be run curricularly by the province, and that parents or students can somehow work on provincial boards. We know that Indigenous peoples, when it comes to being involved in anything provincially, will be marked as the margin. They will be marked as the minority. They'll be marked as those who are extra. And the fact is that we have to center Indigenous peoples more than ever. And the work that is now being done within school districts throughout the province are finally, like myself, I was the very first Indigenous teacher in the south end of Winnipeg. Let me just say that again. I started when I was teaching in 2000. I was the very first Indigenous teacher in that area of Winnipeg. And that meant for approximately 50 schools, I was it. I am the only one. And we live in a generation of firsts where there are a few of us who then enter into that profession, luckily, because of those footsteps and the doors that have been opened by people like Myra Laramie and Helen Settee and Mary Young, people who have opened doors to allow me and now others, now dozens, to begin to enter into those fields. We are going to now take all of the funding, all of the resource capitals, and we're going to erase all of that and then put that in the control of those who frankly are completely incompetent to do so. So if reconciliation is to be possible, we need to be focused on where reconciliation is happening. And where is it happening? It's happening in the rural areas. It's happening in the inner city schools. It's happening within those classrooms that are being led by Indigenous teachers. And frankly, the portion of competent Canadian teachers who are getting up to speed. Why? Because they're often in the classroom beside an Indigenous person. They're working with an Indigenous community. They're being led by Indigenous peoples, by parents and other members of their community within those spaces. That will not happen when you take a centrally located and take the power out of those classrooms, out of those schools, out of those divisions, and place it on Broadway Avenue. Thanks very much, everybody. Miigwech.
Thank you, Negin. Merci and miigwech. It's a really, really important perspective. And once we've got through all our panelists, we will have questions, and I'm sure there'll be plenty. Next is Raj Gill. Raj came to Canada 2.5 years ago. He's in grade 12, and he has from lived experience, a perspective on the immigrant experience. So over to you, Raj, to talk about why we need to pay more attention and different attention to people with immigrant backgrounds.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Gerard. And it's very much an honor to share the stage virtually, although with all the different panelists. Now, before we're getting into my comments about what we can do to solve our the issues that a lot of immigrant students here in our Manitoba curriculum face, I want to just recount my own personal experiences and of one person that I particularly know, and his name is Yu. And I met Yu 3 years ago, and he moved with me to Manitoba, to Winnipeg, to the school I'm in. And a lot of the problems that he faced were very systemic. You know, a lot of the times immigrants don't have the fluency, don't know how to comprehend English or French for that matter as well, because we have 2 official languages. And it is really hard for them, for immigrants to come here to integrate into the society, to the new, totally different educational curriculum. And these are all systemic problems. Now, let me just talk about the challenges themselves. First of all, they're very unique. They're special and unique to the immigrant students. They're very different from what the other Canadian peers, their peers have to go through. There aren't enough tools, resources to help them. Their English proficiency is a huge impediment to them being an effective part of our educational experience. You know, a lot of the times they can't comprehend what's going on. They can't communicate well. It's as simple as just raising your hand and asking a simple question in the classroom. It is a huge hindrance to these immigrant students that come here for a bright future, and all they get is ignorance and just not being able to integrate into our educational system. Let's talk about the inadequate or interrupted schooling in their country of origin. And this is especially a problem for refugee youth who come here. A lot of the times they come from war-torn countries, countries where there aren't enough educational resources, where the educational curriculum is totally different than what we have here in Canada. They miss 2, 3, 4 years of their school, and now they have to come up to speed with their Canadian peers. That poses a serious challenge to them being effective students, having the ability to learn what others are learning. So for that, again, we need very specialized resources, tools, which I will talk about at the end about the solutions. Now, the third challenge, I think, is the discrimination, xenophobia, stereotyping, and all the different types of bullying that happens. It's not just peers, it's not just teachers, it's the society at large. We need to fight racism. And I know we've been talking about this a lot. It is actually a very pervasive thing. It has not left educational system as well. It has come into the educational system. A lot of the times these immigrant students are racially profiled, they're ostracized, they're left out of discussions, they're ignored just because they can't speak English the Canadian way. And this is a serious problem that we need to deal with. Now, the fourth challenge is the lack of teacher quality and training here in Manitoba, and I've experienced it myself. It's one thing to have EAs and one thing to have teachers that are the special teachers that specialize in immigrant education, but it's another to have those teachers that teach other students to have that training to deal with immigrant students, with students of different backgrounds who actually need that support. So training is a big part of combating this problem. Now, coming on to the specific solutions, I think the biggest solution, the biggest way we can solve this problem really is to have specialized programs. And how do they look like? They can include before and after school programs. For example, Ontario has a very robust after school program where immigrant youth, where refugee youth can go, they can talk about how their day was, they can talk about their challenges, they can learn different skills, abilities that can help them integrate into the society, into the Canadian curriculum. And that is, I think, is very effective. And that's one of my contentions as well with this bill. It does nothing to really answer the questions, answer the challenges, the issues that a lot of immigrant youth here in our curriculum are facing, in our society here in Manitoba are facing. Let's talk about the community-led initiatives. They go a long way. They can include peer mentors, they can include past immigrant students. For example, I mentor a new immigrant student and I can help him feel very safe, feel comfortable talking to me. They can ask me anything they want, and that can go a long way. We can have community leaders, elders from that community, from that immigrant group, and that would really help them feel comfortable and heard, because what they are, these immigrant students, they're new to this community, to this country, and we need the community to step up, the community to help them integrate into this new system. Now, the fourth and the final solution I have is more teacher training. I think a lot of the times teachers lack how to problem solve the unique challenges these immigrant and refugee youth have. And if we can have that training integrated, there is some training, and I've certainly experienced a lot of teachers who do have good training when dealing with immigrant students. But if we can integrate that a bit more into the teacher training, that would also help with this problem, with this issue a lot. Now, before I conclude, I just want to say this. To solve this whole problem, to solve the challenges that our immigrant students here in Manitoba are facing, all we need is empathy and compassion. They go a long, long way, just to recognize that the challenges they face are so unique that they need unique solutions. Just empathy and compassion. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. I think those are two really important words. And as Raj has talked to me in the past, one of the things that immigrants need is more education on Indigenous people in Manitoba, so that because that's often been lacking. I'm now going to call on Dougal Dumont, who's our Manitoba Liberal leader, to just say a few words of welcome and to ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say a couple of things. Thank you very much for those presentations. They were fantastic. I just wanted to make a brief sort of overview about some comments about education, because it's always something that was incredibly important to my family. When I was growing up, my father said that education is the great leveler, right? That it is the dream of merit. That if you give somebody, if you can support somebody, and if an education system can help people fulfill their potential, then it can make a huge difference. And he was speaking in part from experience. His own, my grandfather was born in Prince Edward Island and came to Winnipeg working on the railroad, and worked as a lumberjack, and then got a scholarship. And then my father got a scholarship, and I won a scholarship. So of course, these are things that I was able to get access to, right? I recognize that I was incredibly privileged in my access to those things. I was also privileged in other ways, in part because my family growing up, they grew up in Headingley, where they went to school with a group. They went to school with students who were Métis. They went to school with some students even who were Indigenous, French, and it was the middle of the Depression, so these things were sort of, in a sense, taken for granted. And I grew up in a family that was very open to learning and very open to other people. And that's actually one of the greatest gifts that education can bring is deeper understanding of other people. I always think that the greatest challenge that we have, because there is a huge emphasis on STEM, or on science and technology and education and math, the most difficult thing we're ever going to deal with in our lives is always other human beings. They're always the most interesting, difficult, challenging, and even entertaining and engaging problem that we're ever going to have to deal with. Other people, and being able to provide people not just with skills to work, but skills in understanding, skills in compassion, and being able to put yourself in other people's shoes is incredibly important. And those are things that are often not adequately appreciated. In particular, when it comes to the humanities, because I'll actually quote Stephen King. Stephen King, the horror author, wrote a really great book called On Writing, where he said that ultimately what writing does, if you do it well, is it's an act of telepathy. Because if you write it in such a way that you're putting your thoughts into another person's head, as that you can communicate to people in that way. And that's part of what education can do in helping people grow and helping people understand. And those are incredibly important, because recognizing all the divisions and racism that unquestionably exist. The other aspect of it is that I believe the conservatives have an issue that there's an issue between the difference between inquiry, and where we get to ask questions and find out new knowledge and explore new things, and again create things out of nothing, as opposed to applied knowledge. And to use a political stereotype, conservatives seem to be very much in favor of applied knowledge. It's like we already know everything. It's just a question of telling people and sending them off. And to the point, we have seen just in the last 2 weeks with the discovery in Kamloops. This is an example of something that was, in a sense, known, but that has completely changed and shocked people, even though it was something that was known for a very long time. So this education through understanding, this is why it's so important. But the other is that education, like anything else, can be powerful either for good or for bad. So we have to be making sure that we're making the investments that we need to, and recognizing that I mean, actually, I'll quote a former opponent of mine who ran against me, Françoise Thierry-Avignon for the Green Party. If we're not investing in our children, we're not investing in the future. And that's it. It's a moral issue as well as a political issue as well as an economic issue. But that we're talking about the necessity of what we're doing for the future of our province. And I'm about 50, and I'm alarmed by what I've seen in growing divisions. I'm not going to pretend that there was absolutely open racism in many ways when I was young, but there are really serious divisions now too, which are out in the open and tolerated in ways that are truly terrible. So that being said, I think we have an enormous opportunity that we have to seize. I'll quote. I'll also say one other thing. I just wanted to mention, building on Negin's comments. He's talking about the local knowledge. It's another quote from Sun Tzu, from The Art of War, which might be another. But because when you're in politics, you get pompous, and you start thinking to yourself, "I need to read books about military strategy to be able to win elections." But it was a brilliant comment. He said, "Well, what you need to do you actually need to know what's going on, and you can't rely on soothsayers. You can't go and read a horoscope. You can't just sit in a room and talk to your advisors to be able to figure out what's going on. The only way you can act effectively is if you go and talk to somebody who knows the facts on the front line." And that's always resonated with me. And actually, because John and I, we've traveled to places like Nelson. We've traveled across the north to Island Lakes and Nelson House, and there is absolutely top-notch, incredible work, some of the greatest work you'll ever see, but it doesn't get talked about. It's not just because it's First Nation, but it's because it's too far away from any media center. So there is truly great work being done. And I also came from a family, I'm lucky enough to just, people thought that where people you were keen to judge people on your character, right? It's whether you could do something or not. And my family was also terrible at doing a whole bunch of things as well, which they were quite known for, mechanical things, for example, not terribly good. But sorry, I've rambled a bit. I just wanted to introduce, but the thing about this is that these are all sort of considerations we have to have in the bigger picture of what an education system is going to do. Is that ultimately you want to support children, and you want to provide them with an atmosphere that they can succeed in. And our current system is not doing that, right? It's great for about 80% of the school population, but it's continually been failing 20%. And overwhelmingly that is, and a lot of that is Indigenous families, but that's because they've been forced into poverty in various ways over many decades. So yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I would say, I'm not sure what I will ask Negin. I'm trying to think, what would be is there something that's being used somewhere else that could be used as a model here that you think might be effective to be added to our education system?
Well, let me tell you that taking the control out of universities, which are training teachers, is not the way to do it. And so the provincial government has already done that and now controls tuition, and will control the tuition within universities, which is a break on academic freedom. And on top of that is a perfect way to undermine initiatives, which are the places in which universities need to follow the communities. So now we're removing the power from the communities and removing power from the universities. So guess where Indigenous education is going to fall in all of that? It's going to fall into what will tend to be the be all end all of all education, which they go, okay, well, here's the important stuff: math, arithmetic, science, and et cetera. Whatever they decide the important thing is this week, we're going to standardize test all that stuff. And then Indigenous education is the kind of the extra stuff we do in the extracurriculars on a Friday at noon. But that's stuff we're going to cut, because that's not the important stuff. And so the mandatory expectation within universities of Indigenous education amongst all faculties is a model that has been developed. It was developed in Regina and here, and it's now going to be developed at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Arts. So that's a good initiative. That's a good initiative. It needs to be developed. There already are initiatives that are happening within the Faculty of Education here as well. But we need to keep the center of power there, because guess what? 3 credit hours is like embarrassingly low. Like, you're not even at competency when it comes to that. And so, you know, the Faculty of Medicine, for example, is now making 6 credit hours, which is still embarrassingly low, not even close to the amount of knowledge that we need doctors to when they work with Indigenous communities, which, by the way, every 4th person you're going to meet is going to have Indigenous ancestry or connections to an Indigenous community or be married to an Indigenous person. So that means that every 4th person, every doctor, every dentist, every teacher. And so that means we need to have that competency across the board. So where is it that's happening? There's some really great stuff happening in British Columbia, which involves the mandatory work of teachers within communities. There's a really great program in Ontario called Teach for Canada, which is a partnership between NGOs in urban centers, which are getting teachers to work in northern communities and get that experience, but are being led by those communities to give them the training adequately necessary to work within those communities. And then they have to make a 2-year commitment to stay there. They can't just come in for a 2-month break and then leave, which is the biggest problem of it all, isn't it? You know, and then, you know, there's also hundreds of other initiatives. I'm lucky enough that I get to see initiatives all across the country in terms of mentorship, transition to work projects, some really great stuff in terms of empowerment that works beyond inclusion, because inclusion is not where it's at. The biggest mistake that we can think in terms of reconciliation is that it's a lesson plan. Reconciliation's in the hallways, but that's where we have to focus on it. We have to make sure that there's Indigenous voices on the intercom. There's Indigenous voices in the administration, in the libraries. And when I'm not just talking about one course here, an optional course, which is on the Friday, that's always going to be the one that's cut, but that every single class, every single activity, extracurricular, curricular, every single hire, here's my cat again, just wanting to be a part of this, every single hire that we make requires beyond competency, but real life work with Indigenous communities. And so that's what they're doing out in Saskatchewan now. So, I mean, those are just a few examples.
Oh, good, thank you.
Your cat
I'd
gets
like,
2 minutes for rebuttal.
yeah, thanks. Shandy, can you connect James Bedford? If you're still here, we'd like you as the president of the Manitoba Teachers Society to provide a comment and perspective, if you would.
Hey, thanks, John. It's good to see you, and thanks to all the panelists. I think this has been a marvelous conversation. I put it into the chat that everybody is speaking about how to improve Manitoba's public education system, and I think everyone in the province would agree there's room for improvement, but no presenter, I don't think, actually referenced Bill 64. And John, brilliant evening, because you're focusing on exactly what Bill 64 isn't focusing on.
Oh. Thank you. Now we've got a number of questions which are in the chat. One of the things that I did notice was the concern for Doug and Heather that people had that kids might be stigmatized if they were put in sort of a lower grouping. How do you get around that and tell us what actually happens in practice?
Well, what we found, sorry, Doug, what we found when we began this whole process was that if we grouped every group together, and we worked on an activity of some kind or a game of some kind, and then we split in, and yes, there were questions, I won't deny that, but they soon dissolved because the kids became so engaged in what they were doing and so in love with their learning that they really didn't pay any attention to that. And it was kind of nice for the older children. If I had one boy in grade 6 was working in a group that maybe we're grade 3 or whatever, he loved it because he shone. He became a leader. He felt that he was that he counted, that he contributed in a way he had never done before. Doug, would you add to that?
Yes, I would agree with that. And the other thing is that we have to remember that we didn't keep these children in the same groups all the time. We moved children around for every outcome that we taught and had them grouped. We went through curriculum and we grouped sort of outcomes that were similar, and we would make groupings for maybe 3 outcomes, and children would stay together because they fit those groups for those outcomes. But they may be working, in a traditional grade 6 classroom, but functioning at a grade 3 level with certain outcomes. So that was the level of instruction that they received. When it was another outcome, if they were stronger in certain things, then they would be moved, later with a different group, and there would be different children in that. And what we found was that there were many less discipline problems. People felt confident, they felt engaged, they felt that they could do the work. And we never, I believe, Heather, am I correct in this? We never really found anybody that felt stigmatized. They were pleased in the group that they were in, because everyone there was able to cope with the work that they had and were able to move forward.
The other thing that we were careful not to do was, I, being the grade 6 teacher, would often work with many that were in Doug's group. So it wasn't, the children did not see, oh, I've got the grade 6 teacher, oh, I've got the grade 3 teacher. But it was rather, this is my teacher. This is who I'm learning with right now. And we switched those teachers around a lot.
We called ourselves a community of learners.
Yes.
Good. No, I think it's amazing when I talk to pediatrician friends and they tell me about all the kids with behavioral problems, and here is an approach in a school which can actually dramatically reduce behavioral problems, and that's pretty amazing. Negin, one of the questions which is coming up in the chat is how to deal with trauma. Now, we're facing right now a situation with learning and kids learning about the kids buried in unmarked graves in Kamloops, and terrible stories, and very difficult to deal with. How do we help students, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, immigrant students, deal with very traumatic things?
So I do workshops on this, so I'll try to be as concise as possible without going too down into a big extensive explanation. But there's 2 types of trauma that's happening in the country. One is Indigenous trauma, which has been happening for over a century and a half, 2 centuries, 3 centuries. And it involves displacement of territory, loss of language, the ongoing assaults that are happening every day within the environments. We can just have to look around to sort of see. So that, the ongoing violence that's happening. The second is a kind of trauma that is quite undiagnosed, but it's very real. And it's the realization by Canadians that they are not prepared for this conversation, and they're not prepared for what is the truth of the country, which is that Canada is built on genocide. It's built on an exploitative economy. It's based on a culture that has been built off exploiting and misrepresenting Indigenous peoples. It's built off every aspect of this country is on Indigenous lands and territories, most of it's stolen. And so when that realization happens, there's 2 reactions. One is, this has nothing to do with me, or how dare you bring this up, which is both driving towards silence, that, this kind of movement towards silence. And that's what trauma does. The outcome of trauma is always silence, meaning people don't want to talk about it. They want to deny, or so just talking about it is a corrective to trauma, meaning that when we talk about these things, it can be very difficult and uncomfortable, painful, but it's important that we talk about them. It's important that when we talk about Canada Day in the next 2 weeks, that we talk about Kamloops, and we talk about Brandon, and we talk about the thousands of others. There's likely around 25,000 deaths in residential schools, and that's a somewhat conservative number, and that's just in terms of we just think about the amount of deaths per capita per average, and you know, it's a baffling number. I mean, schools were not built for Indigenous children for them to learn anything. It was them for the most part to culturally and physically die. That's what those places were intended to do. And I don't care who says anything else about it, but both the TRC and the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry said that. So talking about it is a big first step. Another way that we deal with it is we have to deal with the gross issue of mental health challenges within Indigenous lives. And the fact is that for many of us, including myself, we have a great deal of trauma that is within our families that come out of those racist draconian policies. And so being able to, you know, I have a piece coming out on I'm not sure if it's Saturday or Sunday in the Free Press. It talks about the trauma that I share with my father. And it's taken me a whole lifetime to forgive him and to reconcile with my own father, the man that I love. And that, you know, and it all goes back to my grandfather's abuse that he brought into our own family. That's a very real experience. So talking about it is the first step. And then also having teachers, counselors. You know, one of the biggest struggles that I've ever had in my life when I went into therapy, and I don't mean to make this about me, but, you know, when I went into therapy to understand my experiences with trauma within my own life, I could not find one therapist in this province who had competency on what Indigenous peoples were going through. I finally found an Indigenous therapist who could maybe understand somewhat. And, you know, it was just a baffling and brain-numbing experience to go through that. So we need to create counselors, therapists, nurses, doctors who are informed on trauma and have trauma-informed care. And we need to do it yesterday. The fact is that we need to mandate that experience for everyone in the healthcare profession, because the most racist legacies that go on are within the justice, health, and education system, child welfare, and language and culture, all the aspects that we teach language and culture. Those are the most racist. That's what the TRC said. And that's what that is the truth, is that we have some of those worst legacies there. So trauma-informed care. But then I also would say on top of that, we need to be kind and generous and show that same kind of trauma-informed care to Canadians who are waking up to this history, are scared, are anxiety-ridden, and are really having a hard time with how do we reconcile Donovan Bailey and Sidney Crosby's golden goal and all the great things that we think Canada is, all this maple syrup, with the fact that there's blood on the flag. And Canadians are not ready. So what Canadians want to do is they want to get very angry. They want to turn to certain fascist, racist groups who make them feel better. They want to turn to racist politicians who cater to those groups and cater to that to get power. And the fact is that if we don't encourage and support and show kindness to Canadians who are at a very early point in this conversation, you know, Indigenous peoples have been thinking about non-Indigenous peoples for centuries. We've been thinking about, that's what the treaties are about. We've been thinking about you guys, but Canadians have not thought about us for probably until the TRC. Didn't even think that they had to deal with us until about the TRC. And then this word reconciliation comes to force. And now suddenly Canadians are like, what does that mean? This has nothing to do with me, or how dare you bring this up? And that's where the trauma is. So what I would say is trauma-informed care in every aspect of the professions of this province.
Thank you. Victoria, you talked about project-based learning, but one of the things that you mentioned to me as we were going through the preparation was that you were seeing around you in school that there were some kids who were really, you know, academically very, very smart, but they didn't have the life skills that they really needed to be able to work with other people and to, you know, be a fully functioning and fully capable person. Can you expand a little bit on that and how you think we've got to, you know, adapt and change schools?
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, exactly like you said, throughout my whole school experience, I had always seen that they were getting like high 90s across the board and getting awards, academic awards, which is very commendable. That's awesome. But these same kids had no idea how to navigate outside of the academic realm. A lot of them didn't know how to, like, even in grade 12, I had people coming and asking, oh, can you help me make a resume? I don't know what to do. I have no idea how to get a job, no anything except studying. A lot of kids are not learning any sort of even social interaction, professional skills, or anything of that manner. There's a lot of kids that are just solely focusing on the math, the English, all the testing and stuff that you see, which is valuable. But when you enter the real world, you're not going to be speaking in formulas and vocabulary definitions. So it's really important. And that's why I like the project-based learning approach, and whichever presented about the leadership approach. I think both of those methods and any kind of similar structure provides students with the authority, and it kind of brings out that maturity. It allows them to learn not only how to get good grades, but also how to actually learn from the material that they're supposed to be absorbing. I know on the other side of that may not be doing well in school, they think a lot of the time, oh, well, this is just school. I just have to memorize this and spit it out on a never have to think again, which is, again, that's a really big problem too, because kids are losing the motivation to even try more than just regurgitating information. So I think any kind of model that gives students that authority and allows them to develop their own skills, it impacts students, I think, will produce more successful results. Because it's really sad. You'll have kids at the top of their class, and then once they graduate, they go into university or they go to whatever path they want to pursue, and they're kind of not helpless. They're very ill-equipped to navigate the adult world, especially. So yeah, I think anything that kind of helps build that self-confidence and that empowerment and allows students to develop their own sense of maturity and to follow their interests, I think will provide that engagement that's needed to fix that.
Raj, thank you, Victoria. One of the things that you had mentioned to me as we were discussing this was that you felt that you weren't getting, as an immigrant, enough education about Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, as somebody who's a new Manitoban. Can you expand a little bit on that and help us sort of to understand what more needs to be done? And
Yeah, definitely, John. I, like a lot of immigrants that come here to Canada, they have this image of Canada as this glorious free country full of beautiful and of good people, which is true in some sense. But very often, a lot of immigrants are not exposed to the past experiences about our history, what happened in Manitoba, what Indigenous people had to go through in our history, and that really is a problem. Personally speaking, I didn't know about the Indigenous history until about grade 11, when there was a course in history in grade 11, and my teacher was really good at teaching me about it. And even then, in that history course, I found that there could have been more, Indigenous education and educating us, especially about the challenges and issues that Indigenous people face. And I think immigrants should have some programs or study groups, specialized education that really gets them up to speed with, and really familiarizes with them with what the Indigenous people had to go through, what the traumatic past experiences or Canadian history has been. And I think that can go a long way when it comes to reconciliation. And I think I would really appreciate it if we can see more of it in our educational curriculum.
okay, thank you. One of the issues that I see in the chat, and it's relevant to what you've talked about, Sheva, leadership. I mean, what was intriguing to me about the leadership is that the students would see the janitor as the leader in cleanliness in the school, and the cook as a leader in nutrition in the school. That, and every child can be seen as a leader. And I didn't understand this as much until I met a family who've got a child with cerebral palsy. And they insisted, much against all sorts of advice, that he go into a French immersion program. And he's only partly verbal. And the teachers and everyone else were asking, why are you putting him in French immersion program? And it turned out that he was able to bond and influence the other kids in really amazing kinds of ways. I mean, he had a disability, and the teacher told me afterwards that it was one of the best things that had ever happened to that class, was to have this kid with a disability, and the other kids were focused on not only helping him, but seeing him as somebody who was, had something unique and an ability, in a sense, a quality of leadership, which you would never have initially thought. Tell us a little bit more about why seeing kids as leaders who are seeing themselves as, disadvantaged and poor can make a difference in their lifestyle and how we see other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that example just is a paragon of the I guess just the way that this can really impact someone to their core, to be seen as a leader. Yeah, I think of it in terms of other children viewing them as a leader, and then them reflecting that. Or maybe it happens the other way around, or maybe it's teachers seeing them as a leader that causes that, or maybe it's everything all combined. But students, any student has something that they are good at, something that they love doing, and maybe that's not something that they ever paid attention to because in school it wasn't valued, or maybe their parents didn't notice it. But if they can bring that into the classroom, and if that can be seen as something that's worthy of attention from their peers and their teachers, I think that can just give the kids some sort of grounding to, as I said before, to do other things, because I do think that it is having something to hold on to, like something that, makes you you, or makes you competent, like that's having that can just lead you to everywhere else. And I can speak from personal experience that when I was a kid, like the thing that I was good at was not something that ever touched the school classroom. I played cello, and that was completely unrelated, but it just having that gave me some sort of confidence that, like, okay, things are going to be okay because I'm good at something. And I think that, I did wish that my peers knew that about me. So if everyone can have that there's just something that people know them for, and that they know themselves to be good at, that can go a long way.
Okay, thank you. Now, Shandy, you said that Michael has a question. Can you link Michael in so he can ask it?
Absolutely. Michael Grenier?
So, Michael, you'll have to unmute, and then you can ask your question.
Sorry, I didn't have a question. I accidentally hit the button when I was transitioning my phone. I have a question. I apologize.
All right, no problem. We're just glad that you're here and listening in and interesting. One of the questions I see in the chat relates to concerns about the parent council. I mean, what is being proposed is, instead of school boards, that there will be, in essence, sort of mini school boards, which will really be what they're calling community council, but really parent councils. I think there's a lot of concern that this would not function very well, but I'd be interested, Negin, your thoughts. I mean, this is perhaps just trying to cover up the fact that they're not paying attention to local issues, but
I don't want to take up too much more time. I've already taken a lot of space tonight, so I'll just say two things about the parent council, the eradication of parent councils, or the centralization of parent councils. If you go to any any school division, any school district, even the rural ones which service very large segments of the Indigenous community, you will not find Indigenous parents as a part of those committees. You will find them on a very small proportion. And oftentimes those people who are part of that are people who are oftentimes doing 8, 9, 10 other committees, because they are the people within those committees who have the ability to do so. They're often not people perhaps in the middle class, for example. The fact is this, that committees, parent committees, any other committees, frankly, that require Indigenous involvement oftentimes either do one of two things: either include Indigenous peoples as an ornament, or just say things like, well, this is what the participation requires. And people in poverty cannot, they're just not in the ability or the social situation in which they're able to. They're often working multiple jobs. They're dealing with multiple issues at home, multiple issues involving childcare. There's very little childcare on First Nations, as just an example. So what's going to happen with this mega parent council or these decentralization or the centralization of parent councils? Well, we're going to see less and less Indigenous parents involvement. So no surprise there that these things are designed specifically to disenfranchise, to remove Indigenous involvement. And it maybe, they could say, people could say it's not conscious to do so, but guess what the outcome is? The outcome is the same. And so the fact is that the parent council idea is highly problematic, and it takes into consideration absolutely nothing of what the context of what a real Manitoba actually looks like. It needs to look like.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's important that we get that feel from different perspectives. One of the questions in the chat is, what is the Liberal Party doing to stop this horrific bill? We have gotten, there's some things in the chat, but maybe Dougal, you can talk a little bit about the campaign that we are engaged in to stop this bill, and maybe James Bedford would comment as well.
Yes. Well, there were a couple of things. We were right out the gate. We were the first party to start putting up no Bill 64 signs. It was very clear right from the very day that it dropped that we had that it wasn't going to work, because they dropped a bill that wasn't the same as the report they dropped 2 hours later. Right. So they had a K-12 review, which made a bunch of recommendations, some of which we agreed with, some which we didn't. But then the bill itself was at odds with that. And it was very clear that they were just going to try to push ahead with it as hard as they could. The NDP have postponed this bill to the fall. And what we're doing, aside from having a sign campaign and telling people about how bad this bill is, we think we're calling for a referendum. There is no automatic trigger to have a referendum in Manitoba. But we've had over, I think, almost 8,000 people have signed have signed it. And it's partly, I'll be honest, because the PCs love to call for referendums all the time. They think that there should be referendums for new hydro dams, or if you want to put the PST up, or raise taxes, or decide whether people can cross the street at Portage and Main. Those are all things that we have referendums for. This, because they never in their 2019 platform said they were going to do this. It is an absolutely massive change to our education system, which is one of the pillars of what a provincial government does. It doesn't appear to have any popular support. We are hearing from people across Winnipeg and across Manitoba, southern Manitoba, Brandon, the Parklands, the north. It's a huge problem for everybody for all the reasons we've dealt with. And even in Hanover, where the chair of the school division, I think, is the brother of the Conservative MP, he said this bill blows up the entire K-12 system with no plan to glue it back together. So we think that we want to put as much pressure on this government as possible, and we're going to be spending more time over the summer getting people to sign up and asking for a petition. Having this petition, it's in the chat, a change.org petition to have a referendum. And then beyond that, we'll have days of action and further actions that people can do. We also want to make sure this should be bigger than the Manitoba Liberal Party. There's lots of things bigger than the Manitoba Liberal Party, but this is bigger than any one party. So this is something where we are more than happy to work with anyone from any party and anyone from anywhere, because it should not be a partisan issue, because this is much bigger than that. This is a change for the entire education system. So sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add one thing. I really appreciate you saying the cross-political how important it is to create alliances at this time, because I can't agree more. Not a part of any political party, but I'm willing to work with anyone to stop this bill. But here's the strategy that this government has entailed over the past. And I happen to have been on strike as a professor at the University of Manitoba, so I've seen the strategy in which how this plays out. So what will happen is this government will propose something very aggressive and then expect to get in the middle path, but that same high level of aggression, but would never be accepted if they came out with the mid-level aggression. Instead, what they do is they're overly aggressive, and then when they step back from the over-aggression, then we get the middle path, which is still absolutely atrocious and terrible.
They're equally, they appear moderate, but they're still cutting, right? So you're right.
Absolutely. So what they say things is like
a 30% cut, and then they say, well, we only gave you 10, right?
So I'll just give you an example at the University of Manitoba. They told all of us that we're going to have to cut every faculty by 20% cost. Like, that is unheard of. Like, I don't even know what that looks like. It's like literally no more paper in faculties. Like, it's totally crazy and insane. And then so everybody freaked out, and but in the end of the day, they went, no, it's actually 5%, and everybody went, whew. But like 5% is still basically all of our administrative staff gone. Almost all of our new programming gone. We've already got the lowest salaries, the lowest retention rates, the lowest success rates within the country. I mean, now we're going to cut that even further. So I just mean that's the strategy that I think that's going to play out here, if you want my personal opinion. But we need to be a lot allied in this response, particularly for this bill. And
and I think so. That's part of it, is that we've ideally, what I would like this is that I would like to be a part of something that somebody basically slightly nonpartisan is leading. There's a group called Parents for Public Education with Luann Carn. They've been doing some great stuff. And the other part of it is just from a political point of view, there's when it comes to pure political power and democracy, what they're also trying to accomplish in this is straight out of an American playbook. And this is a way of breaking unions. The entire strategy of saying we're going to bring 30 bills in, you're not going to be able to fight them all at once. We're only going to be able to stop a few of them. It's to break unions, especially the Manitoba Teachers Union Society, sorry, James, because of perceptions that they will always vote for the other side. So this is beyond all the issues around education or saving money. This is about trying to create a permanent conservative majority for this government, for this party, right? That's what you've seen in the US, because what they've discovered, more people turn out for federal elections, so you tend to get split. So you'll get a Liberal Party federally, you'll get a Joe Biden for president, but all of your states, or 40 of your states, will be Republican, and a whole bunch of your provinces will all be conservatives. So there is a deliberate strategy on the part of conservatives to say we need to focus on stopping anything progressive from ever happening at the local level. Because reporters don't pay as much attention, people don't pay as much attention. But the one thing that's different about this, I hope, fingers crossed, is that there are people in rural areas, is that I will say that the attack on universities is sort of a traditional target, and they'll sort of say, well, we don't care about you because you're never going to vote for us anyway. This actually continually hurts. This actually attacks rural, this attacks their base. So we have an opportunity. I'm not saying we're going to flip Steinbach red, or we're going to flip Steinbach orange or green or whatever, but you can raise levels of anxiety, and we have an opportunity over the summer to organize against it. And if you can get a critical mass, I think that there are possibilities we can push back on it. Anyway, and look, it's an imperfect solution because there's no guarantee, but I sort of feel, I think there's a very strong case. If you look at what the things that the PCs asked for when they say we've got to have a referendum, a lot of them are way less than what they're asking for here. And they never ran on this. So, and that's something that their own base, who aren't pleased with this, can also buy into. So, and that's part of the importance of bringing this together, because we talked with NDP, Conservative, Liberal, you name it, who don't like this bill. And it's in deep blue areas as well as deep orange and whatever, and everywhere deep red. There are little pockets of deep red around. So, and so look, and ultimately, like part of this is that there are no guarantees in this, right? But I think this is an opportunity for us to push as hard as we possibly can.
Thank you, Dougal. Let me give James Bedford a chance to talk, because you're one of the leaders in this fight. And as Dougal has said, we're ready to work with anybody because this is a horrible bill. And part of what we're doing tonight is exposing what is badly missing in this bill. This is the third of a series of town halls that we've had, and we've strategically asked questions in the legislature to expose big gaps. I asked a question, for example, one of the first ones, why the word Indigenous was only used once or twice in the whole bill, and there was virtually no attention to Indigenous concerns and Indigenous issues in this bill whatsoever. It was atrocious. But James Bedford, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about the campaign.
Well, thanks, John. I'll begin by saying, you know, we are a nonpartisan organization. I think the minister would like you to believe otherwise, but we are very much a nonpartisan organization. So believe it or not, this isn't about choosing politics. It's really about choosing the future of our students. And as we've often said, you know, the learning conditions of students are the working conditions of their teachers, of their educational assistants, of their custodians, of their bus drivers, and so on. So I think that's the position where we come from. Even I'm a little taken aback by how quickly the province has been mobilized in terms of speaking about this piece of legislation. And the biggest part of it, I think, is speaking about how the legislation is supposed to make things better for students in classrooms. But the legislation is all about the governance of the school system. And you began this evening, John, looking at or using the example of the Seine River School Division. I'm quite familiar with the Seine River School Division. I've visited many of their schools, talked to a lot of members there. I know the superintendent well, and Seine River is a perfect example of how the system currently works, where school trustees who are responsible to those who elect them see some deficiencies. They see some things that need to be done to improve student learning in classrooms. So they turn to their superintendent, their CEO, and say, in very simple terms, here's something you need to fix. And the superintendent in Seine River goes to work with a lot of very learned professionals. And quite frankly, he works with parents as well through parent councils and comes up with a plan to improve things. And there's some remarkable programming going on in the Seine River School Division. I've sat in classrooms with Indigenous elders who are working with newcomer students to do exactly that learning that is essential to reconciliation, where they are teaching newcomers about the reconciliation journey that as a newcomer in Canada, you have now found yourself on, and you are going to spend the next part of your life on this journey. And it begins within a public school. So incredible things happening because of the current structure, not in spite of the current structure. And I think that's one of our big concerns is that the focus of the bill is not on improving student learning in classrooms. It actually runs a huge risk of dismantling the systems that currently work well and the systems that currently need to be improved so we can put more resources into classrooms. We've certainly spent a lot of time as an organization talking about where is the connection between the K-12 education review? And I have to share with you, one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about within this piece of legislation is that we're going to lose the good work that was done by the K-12 Education Review Commission. That review needed to be done, and we knew it needed to be done. All you needed to do was attend one of the many sessions they held and looked at the hundreds and hundreds of people in this province who turned out to talk about our public schools and how to fix them. And students were there, teachers were there, parents were there, but everybody from communities were there. And the question that we're asking, and I think you've touched on it tonight, is where are those recommendations reflected in the piece of legislation? Because they're not there. And if they're not in the legislation, are we ever going to see them find their way into our schools and into our classrooms? And that's the fundamental issue. And you know, I'll put a plug in for our organization. I'm perhaps a little more positive about the future than Dugald is. And I certainly mean no offense, Dugald, because I know we see eye to eye in a number of issues, but I do see a lot of strength in our organization going forward. It is part of our mandate, part of our constitution to be speaking up for public education. That's not going to change. We speak up and support the learning of students in our classrooms. That's certainly not going to change. We still want to engage with parents. It's just that we want to ensure that those people responsible for the decision-making within our public schools are properly prepared to make the decisions. And I think Negin has definitely pointed out one of the big concerns we have is that, you know, there's a certain type of parent who has the ability, the time, the energy to be involved in the running of their local school. And those parents aren't really reflective of who everybody in Manitoba is. And that's a deep concern for us. So our hope is, and I encourage folks to visit mbteach.org, because our staff has done an incredible amount of work and continues to do an incredible amount of work in terms of informing our members, but informing the public of our concerns within the piece of legislation. And we have a network of local leaders, and I've done many of these presentations myself, and I'm happy to respond to presentations and say, from a teacher's perspective, here are the concerns that we have with Bill 64. I think I'll leave it with this one idea is the most frustrating thing with me for an educator. And I think every presenter who's talked about experience in public schools has fundamentally said this, is that success is built on a relationship. It's built on students working with one another. It's built on teachers working with students. It's built on knowing each other. And the thing I find absolutely most frustrating is that I have never had a conversation with the minister on Bill 64. And I find that frustrating because as an educator, everything is based on having a conversation. It's incredibly difficult right now to teach students when you're not physically in the classroom with them, but we still facilitate those conversations, you know, through technology and Zoom meetings. To not be able to discuss with the minister, here are the concerns we have, because I do believe deep down inside, everybody wants the best for students. It's just a question of how do we get there? And without those conversations, I just don't know how we're going to get there.
If I can, I'll just be very brief.
Not with this
piece. Sorry, James.
So
thank you so much. I just wanted to say one thing, but which is relevant to what you just said. There's a standard first question that we ask in the legislature whenever anyone brings in a bill. Who did you consult with before this bill? And I actually realized we may have forgotten to ask that question because I don't know who they did. I don't know because they ignored the people that they actually did consult with. Anyway, that's thank you, James.
Yeah. Okay. Look, anybody who's interested in joining the fight to stop Bill 64 and wants us to involve them, let you know of events, et cetera, please send a direct message to Shandy Strong, who's the host this evening, and give her your email address or phone number or what have you, so that we can stay in touch and we can continue to build this effort. I mean, it is amazing the number of people who are requesting signs. That it is amazing the number of people who have signed the petition. I think it's something over 7,500 in a relatively short period of time. Spread the word to your friends, but let Shandy know so that we can stay in touch with everybody and we can build this. And just to give people a little bit of time in part, and there's one question in the chat, which I think is important one, and I think that probably Doug and Heather can help us answer, but others may. The question is this: many students are passed through the school system and graduated with language and math illiteracy. Should students be held back to repeat grades, or what other solutions do you have for this? So this is, I think, is a question for Doug and Heather, because I think you have an answer for this.
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Yes, because with what we look at with this competency-based education, we're seeing this particularly with language arts and math, and setting up a continuum of the essential outcomes that need to be, mastered in order to be successful in your public education system. And if these outcomes are clearly delineated and outlined, then you have a continuum that can serve as a part of a reporting process. And as students progress in their outcomes, they're highlighted that they're achieved. And so we don't see passing or failing, we see continuing and, moving on. So you may not achieve a specific outcome this year, but you'll be continuing with it next year or in another group, and you just keep moving forward. And we've just touched the iceberg tonight, and we think that it's ludicrous to be assigning children to grade levels, because children don't fit grade levels. And why does the public education system have to be completed in 13 years? For some, it may take 11. For others, it may take 14. Does that really matter? Because it takes you 14 years to complete this? Are you considered a failure? I think not. Heather, can you add?
I can't add anything, Doug. You said it. You've said what we've said to each other so many times. And what we feel so deeply is that grades do not belong in school.
No.
Somehow we got locked into this grade age system, and it does not work. So
no, we don't expect everybody at McDonald's to be 18. And if you want to be a political leader, you have to be 30.
Right. Good point. Let me just say a couple of things in closing things up. I'm going to stay on and be ready to continue to talk with people who want to engage, and Shandy will open it up so we can talk if you just give Shandy your name. Second, I want to mention that the legislative process, this bill will come back in early October, barring some unexpected development. It will go through second reading, and then it will go to committee stage. Anybody in Manitoba can present at committee stage. And the committees are set up to try and make sure that everybody who registers can present. Registering is very simple. You dial 945-3636 and register, And David, if you can put that in the chat, just so that people can see it visually, that would also help.
Already done.
Just dial 204-945-3636 and you can register to speak. And then it'll go from committee back to third reading. And then if it passes third reading in current form or existing form, there could be amendments. And then it will go to royal assent, and then it would be implemented at the date that the government wants it implemented. Now, we hope it never goes that far. We want to stop it. But it's going to take people all over Manitoba rising up in order to do that. I want to pay a particular tribute and thanks to all our panelists. Heather and Doug, you did an amazing job of educating people. You're real teachers about competency-based learning. Victoria and Sheva, two people who've come through and are just finished first year university. You did a remarkable job of being very persuasive about project-based learning and leadership-based learning. And I think that we can, with school boards retained, that we can have a much more flexible system that really responds much better to local needs and can incorporate more of these things. But quite clearly, what you said is extraordinarily important, and it's extraordinarily important because learning in schools is so much more than just math and language. It is all about communication and ethics and cooperation and working together and democracy and so on. So thank you for saying that so clearly. Negin, you're incredibly eloquent and forceful and come across with a really, really important point of view. I have to tell you, I was in 1967, I guess that tells you my age, in northern Saskatchewan, and a community called Montreal Lake. And we were doing a survey and banding eagles at that point, and we dropped in to talk to a couple of teachers, and they said, you know, we're giving books about skyscrapers and cows, and there's no cows and there's no skyscrapers here. These kids don't have anything to relate to. I mean, it struck me that the whole system is changing a little bit. It's a bit better now. It's quite a number of years ago. And not long after, on the same trip, we were in Montreal, and we were talking, and I can't remember who it was, but while we were there, there was some discussion about the activities on Sunday mornings. And this was a community which is probably now 60%, 70% Indigenous. I'm sure it was similar back then, but the movies that were shown were all cowboys and Indians. And the movies of that time, it was the cowboys winning and the Indians losing. And we talked about this, and I said, oh my God, this is just incredibly bad. It's taken a long while to get as far as we have, but we still have a long way to go. But we appreciate your voice, Negin, and it's an incredibly important voice. And in this fight against Bill 64, the voices of leaders and many others in the Indigenous community, I think, are going to be really, really important. So thank you for being here tonight. And Raj, for being in grade 12, you came to one of our earlier town halls about youth and COVID. You're amazing for having been here for 2.5 years to be able to express yourself and really help us to better understand what it's like to be an immigrant. So thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Dugald. Thank you, James Bedford. Thank you, Shandy Strong and David Mintz for helping to coordinate things. So it's teamwork and it's one more step in our battle against Bill 64, exposing the things which aren't there, which are so important. So thank you. Good night. As I said, I will stay on, and anybody who wants to stay and talk, I'll be there at one of our earlier town halls. It was somebody who stayed to talk who had the idea of putting up signs, and he was from Morden. And I listened to him, and we took that message, and within a few days, we had signs out to him and to many other people. So thank you all for being part of this. It's an important effort and a really, I think, significant evening tonight. Thank you.